What happens when you discover the man you've married was once your mother's lost love from decades past? Stick around until the end to see how this incredible twist of fate unfolds. If you enjoy tales of family secrets, healing, and unexpected second chances, please hit that like button and subscribe to never miss our upcoming stories. Wedding days are supposed to be unforgettable. Mine certainly was, though not for the reasons most brides hope for. I can still picture every detail. The cream-colored wallpaper with its delicate golden vine pattern climbing the endless walls of the grand Hawthorne mansion. I remember studying those intricate designs while servants adjusted a wedding dress that felt foreign against my skin, while someone secured my hair so tightly it made my scalp ache. What I remember most clearly was the oppressive silence. Not the peaceful, sacred kind you'd expect, but the heavy, warning kind that settles in your bones and whispers that something is about to shatter. And somehow, you know that something will beat you. There is no beautiful music, no joyful applause. I barely heard the officiant declare us married. All I could focus on was my own shallow breathing when I finally looked up to see Alexander Hawthorne standing before me. His face was like granite, emotionless and distant. No smile crossed his lips. His hands never reached for me tenderly. Even when the priest paused expectantly for the traditional kiss that never came, instead, Alexander simply took my hand, firm, cold, methodical. He placed the ring on my finger with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed this action countless times before. As if I were just another nameless woman who meant absolutely nothing to him. I wasn't special. Not to him, not in this place. But to my mother, I was her entire world. And she desperately needed rescue. So I allowed the ceremony to continue. I let them pronounce me his wife, because long ago, before the crushing debts and her illness, I had sworn to her that I would do whatever it took to keep our family from falling apart. And I had meant every word, the moment the guests dispersed into the ballroom for a reception I hadn't planned. I slipped away unnoticed. No one came looking for me. I discovered the bridal suite on the mansion's second floor, tucked away like an afterthought. The room reeked of expensive polish and wealth, leather, polished wood, and something metallic that reminded me of cold steel. I pressed my back against the closed door, trying to steady my breathing, hoping that stillness might help me collect myself, but the quiet only amplified my anxiety. I walked to the enormous bed and perched on its edge, my hands trembling in my lap. Someone had left a silver tray on the bedside table, champagne, a single white rose, and a card that simply read, "Congratulations." Beautiful lies wrapped in elegant packaging. My half-packed suitcase waited in the corner, containing the only pieces of my true self that remained. I knelt down and searched through the layers of carefully folded clothes, looking for the handkerchief my mother had given me that morning, her way of sending me into battle with something to protect me when my heart already felt like it was breaking apart. I found it tucked beneath an old book of poetry I brought to remind myself of who I used to be. But when I lifted the book, something else fell out, a folded piece of paper, worn and yellowed with age. I recognized that handwriting immediately. My mother's. I stared at it for several moments before finding the courage to unfold it. My dearest. You once wondered why I never stayed, why I never wrote. I convinced myself you would eventually forget me, that I never could. I carry you with me in quiet moments, in the early morning hours, in every breath I've drawn since. I wanted to be courageous. I wanted to fight for what we had, but obligation spoke louder than my heart, and I was never strong enough to choose. You, if this letter ever reaches you, I hope you'll remember me not with anger, but with the love I never stopped feeling. Eleanor, I pressed the letter against my chest, fighting back tears. I didn't need to wonder who that was. New York, the city she never mentioned. The life she never shared with me? Had I just married the very man my mother once loved? Was fate really that cruel? The door creaked softly behind me. I quickly stuffed the letter back into my suitcase, my heart racing. When I turned around, Alexander stood in the doorway, jacket removed, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened like the evening had already exhausted him. He said nothing. He didn't move. For a breathless moment, I wondered if he could hear my heart shattering in the silence between us. Then he gave a single curt nod and turned to leave without a word. The door clicked shut behind him like a sentence I wasn't allowed to finish. Sat there staring at the empty space where he'd been, unsure whether I hated him or felt sorry for him. Then, for reasons I couldn't explain, I reached for the letter. Again, I read it more slowly this time. The words felt different now, heavier, more significant. I had always believed this marriage was about debts, about saving the family business, about some deal made in closed-door meetings. But as I traced the delicate curves of my mother's handwriting, I began to wonder if I had just stepped into a story that began long before my birth. And if that was true, what would I be willing to risk to see it through to the end? I had always imagined New York as something luminous, towering skyscrapers glowing against midnight skies, the constant pulse of life flowing through packed streets, countless windows lit up like earthbound stars. But the Hawthorne estate existed apart from that city. It sat on the outskirts, miles from the energy and noise, hidden behind iron gates and stone walls, a fortress built from wealth and silence. And inside, it felt even colder than the night air outside. I spent my first week drifting from room to room like a specter haunting my own life. No one stopped me. No one welcomed me. It quickly became clear that the staff had been instructed to treat me like furniture, something to dust around and ignore. I would pass them in the corridors and watch them avert their eyes, offer slight bows, and vanish before I could speak a single word. The only voice I heard belonged to Alexander, brief, clipped exchanges about scheduling, occasional questions about my meals, as if I were a guest rather than a wife. Even these conversations felt rehearsed, polite, hollow. He never lingered long enough to ask how I was adjusting. He never stayed to see if I wanted to respond. By the fourth night, I began to forget the sound of my own voice. I sat by the sitting room window, gazing out at the distant city lights that seemed so far away, like they belonged to someone else's existence. I thought of Vermont, of my mother. I had called her every evening, though she tried to sound stronger than she was. Each conversation grew shorter. Each goodbye felt heavier. She would share little stories to fill the silence. How the kettle still whistled too loudly in the mornings. How she hummed old melodies while folding linens at the shop, even though no customers had visited in weeks. I could hear the tremor in her voice when she asked if I was happy. I lied because I didn't know how to explain that I was merely surviving in a house that didn't want me. It was on the fifth night that I overheard his phone conversation. I hadn't contended to eavesdrop. I had wandered down to the library, a room so vast it felt like entering someone else's memory. The door had been left slightly ajar, and his voice carried through the gap. Yes, pay the entire amount. No, she doesn't need to know. Ensure the hospice team maintains their schedule. Whatever they require, just handle it. I held my breath. Hospice, my mother. I covered my mouth with my hand, afraid to make any sound that might break the moment and prevent me from understanding what I just heard. Alexander was paying for her care, not just covering hospital bills or writing checks. For appearances, he had arranged everything quietly, secretly, and I had been completely unaware. I stepped back from the door and nearly knocked over a vase on the hallway table. The sharp ring of glass startled me, but I caught it just in time. I hurried back to the suite before the weight of this revelation could crush me. Why would he do this? Not out of love. He didn't know me. He didn't even seem to like me. It made no sense, unless ... I sat on the bed's edge, staring at the suitcase in the corner. As if it might provide the answers I lacked the courage to seek. I thought about the letter again, the one my mother had written to him. Did he still harbor feelings for her? Was I just a substitute for something he'd lost years ago? And worse, was I the price he was paying for his own regret? I swallowed hard and stood, pacing the floor as if movement might somehow calm the storm. Inside me, that night, I made myself a cup of peppermint tea. The only thing I knew how to do that made me feel connected to home. I sat on the balcony, pulling my sweater tighter as the cool air touched my skin. I cupped the mug in both hands, breathing in the steam, letting it fill the parts of me that felt like they were coming undone. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift to our kitchen back home, to my mother standing by the window, humming softly as she stirred honey into my tea, to the way she used to sit across from me at our table, her eyes gentle and full of quiet hope. "You'll understand someday, Charlotte," she used to say. Love isn't what you think it is when you're young. It's quieter, weightier. It's the choices you make when no one's watching. I pressed the mug to my lips, tasting the familiar warmth. And for the first time since arriving, I allowed the tears to fall, slow and silent. The next morning, I woke to a gentle knock. When I opened the door, a small envelope lay on the floor. No name, no handwriting visible. Inside was a card with 5 words written in neat block letters. Dinner, 7 o'clock. Dining room. No signature, but I knew it was from him. I turned the card over in my hands, wondering why, after days of silence, he had decided to invite me to his table. And more importantly, what he would finally be brave enough to say. I had expected dinner at the Hawthorne estate to be rigid, formal, served by people who never made eye contact. I wasn't mistaken. When I entered the dining room at precisely 7 o'clock, the table was already prepared, white porcelain, polished silver, a single candle flickering in the center like someone had remembered to add warmth but hadn't quite figured out how. Alexander was already seated at the far end. The table between us felt like a chasm, an expanse of silence I wasn't sure either of us knew how to bridge. He didn't rise. He didn't smile. He simply gestured toward the chair, waiting for me, as if this were just another business dinner on his calendar. I sat quietly, folding my hands in my lap to keep them steady. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence pressed in so tightly I thought I might suffocate. Then finally, his voice cut through. "Your mother's condition. I've received updates." I winced. He didn't ask if I wanted to discuss her. He simply stated it like another line item on a report. But there was something in the way his eyes flickered. For half a second, as if he was searching for the right words and finding none. "How long have you been helping her?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Since the day I learned about the debt." I swallowed, gripping the table's edge. "Why?" His jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening around the glass in front of him. He didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than I expected, almost as if it pained him to say it aloud. "Because I owed her." My breath caught. I didn't move, didn't blink. I let the words settle, sink into the cracks I'd been too afraid to explore. I reached for the one thing that had haunted me since finding the letter. "You knew her," I whispered, his eyes locked onto mine, sharp and unwavering. "Yes." The candle between us flickered, casting shadows across the walls like ghosts rising from the past. "How long?" I asked, my voice cracking. He looked down at his hands, as if trying to remember how to explain the weight of years he'd never spoken of. "I met Eleanor in Vermont when I was 20, he began quietly. "I was working with a small architecture firm then. Nothing like what I have now. Your family's shop made wedding dresses for one of our clients. She was kind to me, more than she should have been. He paused, swallowing hard as if the memory still stung. I asked her to leave with me. I had nothing to offer her but a future. I couldn't promise. She said no. She said her family needed her more than I ever could. I felt the ground shift beneath me, as if every step I'd taken since the wedding had been leading to this moment. And you married me because of her? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. No, he said firmly. I married you because I knew you deserved better than the life you were about to lose. Your father's debts were strangling your family. I could stop it. I wanted to stop it. But you didn't tell me, I whispered, his jaw clenched again. I didn't want to chain you to something that felt like a debt being repaid, he said softly. I didn't want you to hate me for saving you in the wrong way. I pressed a hand to my mouth, tears burning behind my eyes. All this time, I had believed. I was just a pawn in a business transaction. But there had been something else, something older, something deeper. That night, I packed a small bag. I needed to see her. When I arrived in Vermont the next afternoon, the sky hung heavy with the kind of gray that makes everything feel slower, quieter. My mother was sitting in her favorite chair by the window, a blanket tucked around her shoulders, the sunlight catching in her hair like it used to when I was little. She smiled when she saw me, but her eyes told me she knew why I had come. I sat on the floor at her feet, resting my head on her knee like I had when I was a child. And for the first time in years, I asked the question I had carried in my heart for too long. Was it him, Mama? I whispered. Was it Alexander? She didn't flinch. She didn't lie. Her fingers moved gently through my hair, soft and slow. Yes, I closed my eyes, letting the tears fall freely. Why didn't you tell me? She sighed, her hand trembling slightly as she cupped my cheek. Because I knew you carry my mistakes like they were yours, she whispered. And I couldn't bear to see you lose yourself trying to fix what I couldn't. I sat up, looking into her eyes that had seen more loss and more love than I could begin to understand. Did you love him? I asked, already knowing the answer. She nodded, tears spilling over her cheeks. And now you do too, she whispered. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to say I didn't know him, that I couldn't possibly feel anything but confusion and anger. But my heart had already betrayed me. I stayed with her that night, holding her hand until she fell asleep. And in the stillness, I knew this story had begun long before I was born. That maybe, just maybe, I was meant to finish it. I used to believe people's hearts could shut like doors. I used to believe mine had. But as I stood on the porch of my mother's house the next morning, staring down at the suitcase by my feet, I knew I had been wrong. I had spent so much of my life trying to hold everything together. The shop, my mother, my father's mistakes, my own fears. But the truth was, I had never held anything. I had only been holding my breath. And now it was time to face him. I returned to the city by late afternoon. I didn't call ahead. I didn't send word. I needed to know what he would say when he wasn't expecting me. The car pulled up to the estate, and for the first time since I had married him, I didn't feel like a stranger on the wrong side of the gate. I felt like someone who deserved answers. The butler opened the door before I reached for the handle, his expression unreadable. He's in the garden, he murmured, as if he had been waiting for this moment as long as I had. I had never entered the garden before. It was hidden behind the house, enclosed by hedges taller than I could see over, a world apart from the cold marble halls and polished wood floors. And there he was. Alexander stood with his back to me, sleeves rolled to his, elbows, hands buried in the soil as he knelt beside a patch of freshly planted mint. I watched him for a moment, unsure if I was ready to break the quiet between us. But when I saw his shoulders rise and fall, not with the steady control I had grown accustomed to, but with something heavier, something that looked like exhaustion, I knew I couldn't stand in the shadows any longer. "You remembered," I said softly. He froze, his hands stilled in the dirt. Slowly, he turned to face me. His eyes, those same eyes that had once looked through me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience, now held something I wasn't ready to name. "Your mother used to grow it," he replied quietly, "in Vermont. I thought maybe it would help. You feel less alone here." I took a step closer, then another, until I was standing only a few feet away from him. "You could have told me," I whispered. He stood slowly, brushing the dirt from his hands, but he didn't reach for me. He didn't dare. "I didn't know how," he said. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. "I found her letter," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I know about you and my mother. I know everything." His jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "I was going to leave her behind," he said softly. "Once, years ago, I told myself I could move on, build something without her." He took a step closer, his voice cracking for the first time since I had met him, but I never did. I felt my heart twist in my chest. "Did you marry me to replace her?" He flinched like I had struck him. "No," he said, his voice breaking. "I married you because I couldn't bear to watch you lose everything the way I lost her. And somewhere along the way, I started wanting you for who you are, not who she was." I shook my head, fighting back tears, "But you never let me in. You kept me at arm's length. You made me feel like I was nothing more than a contract." He closed the distance between us slowly, carefully, like he wasn't sure I'd let him come any closer. And then, for the first time since we had said our vows, he dropped to his knees. I gasped, the world tilting beneath me as I watched a man I thought was made of steel collapse in front of me. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so damn sorry, Charlotte. I didn't know how to love you the right way. I didn't think you'd ever want me if you knew the truth." I fell to my knees in front of him, my hands trembling as I reached for his face. His breath hitched when I touched him, softly, slowly, like I was learning him for the first time. "I wanted you," I whispered. "Not the money, not the mansion. You." His eyes closed, a tear slipping down his cheek before he could stop it. I leaned in, pressing my forehead to his. And for the first time, he let himself fall apart in my arms. Stayed like that until the sun dipped below the horizon, the garden bathed in soft gold. And when he finally pulled back, his voice was steady again, but softer this time. "Stay," he whispered. "Not because you have to, because you want to." I reached for his hand, placing my fingers through his, grounding us both in something real. "I'm tired of running," I whispered. And I meant it. I was tired of carrying the weight of everyone else's mistakes, tired of hiding behind duty and fear. It was time to stop holding my breath. Time to choose something for myself, Dot, and this time I chose him. That night, we didn't speak much. We didn't need to. We sat together in the kitchen, hands wrapped around warm mugs of peppermint tea, the scent filling the room like a memory reborn. No velvet gowns, no polished silver, no business deals or silent stares, just two people learning how to start again. And in that quiet, I knew we had already begun. Dot, it should have felt like a beginning. But the truth is, I woke the next morning with a restlessness I couldn't shake. Alexander had fallen asleep in the armchair by the window, his head tilted back, his chest rising and falling in the quiet rhythm of someone finally unburdened. I watched him for a long while, memorizing the way the first soft light of dawn touched his face. I could have stayed. I could have leaned into the peace of that moment, convinced myself we'd turned some invisible corner, that the worst was over. But something deep inside me whispered otherwise. I packed a small bag before he woke, careful not to make a sound. I didn't leave a note. I didn't need to. We both knew there were still pieces of this story left unresolved. I stood at the doorway one last time, my heart tight in my chest as I looked back at him. And then I left. The drive to Vermont felt shorter this time. Or maybe I had grown used to measuring distance by something other than miles. I arrived just as the sun was beginning to warm the porch of my mother's house. She was already awake, sitting by the window with a worn quilt draped over her knees, a small smile tugging at her lips when she saw me walk through the door. "I was wondering when you'd come home," she whispered. I sank to the floor beside her, chair again, resting my head on her lap like I had before. "I needed space to think," I murmured. She ran her fingers through my hair the way she used to when I was little. "Did you find what you were looking for?" I swallowed, unsure of how to answer. "I found the truth," I whispered. "But I don't know if I'm brave enough to live with it." We sat in silence for a long while, the steady tick of the old clock filling the room. And then, as if she had waited all night to say it, she spoke. "Sometimes love doesn't feel like freedom, Charlotte," she sighed quietly. "Sometimes it feels like standing still in a storm, holding your ground when everything inside you wants to run." I closed my eyes, letting her words settle deep in the places I'd tried so hard to ignore. Later that evening, I took a walk to clear my mind. The small cafe at the edge of town had always been my refuge, the place I used to go when I needed to remember who I was before life got too heavy. The owner, a kind woman named Beth, waved to me as I entered, pointing to my favorite corner table. Without needing to ask Dot, I ordered tea, settling into the warm leather booth, staring out the window as the street lamps flickered to life. And that's when I saw him. Alexander stood outside on the sidewalk, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his face half shadowed by the glow of the streetlight. He didn't move. He didn't come inside. He just stood there, watching me through the glass like he had no right to cross the distance between us. I don't know how long I sat there staring back at him, but eventually I stood. I stepped outside, wrapping my coat tighter around me as the cold bit at my skin. We stood in silence. For a moment, the air thick with everything neither of us knew how to say. "I didn't think you'd follow me here," I whispered. His shoulders tensed, but he didn't look away. "I told you I wouldn't let you go until you wanted me to," he said softly. I felt the weight of his words settle over me like snow. "I don't know if I can give you what you want," I admitted. "I don't even know who I am anymore." He stepped closer, stopping just short of touching me. "Then let me wait with you while you figure it out," he whispered. My breath caught. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that this wasn't just another promise waiting to be broken. But the truth was, I didn't know how. I turned to leave, my heart pounding in my chest. But then he called my name, soft like a plea. I froze. When I turned back, he was holding something in his hands, a small leather-bound notebook. He stepped forward, offering it to me like it was something fragile. I took it, my fingers trembling as I opened the cover. Inside, page after page, my name, dates, memories. The first time he saw me in the dress shop in Vermont, the way I tucked my hair behind my ear when I was nervous, the night I stood under the chandelier, too afraid to look him in the eye. Every page was filled with observations, small things I hadn't even noticed about myself. I felt my throat tighten as I turned the last page. At the bottom, written in careful script, "I've been falling in love with you quietly, Charlotte, long before you ever knew." Tears slipped down my cheeks before I could stop them. I looked up, finding him still standing there, not demanding, not forcing, just waiting. I didn't run to him. I didn't throw my arms around his neck. Instead, I did the one thing I hadn't been brave enough to do until now. I nodded, one small, simple nod, the kind that says, "I see you. And maybe, just maybe, I'm ready to be seen too." He didn't move, as if he was afraid to break the fragile thread holding us together. But when I took the first step toward him, his breath hitched. And in that moment, I knew he wasn't here to win. He was here to stay, and maybe so was I doubt we didn't speak on the walk back to my mother's house. The night air pressed around us, heavy and cool, filling the space between our footsteps. It wasn't the kind of silence that hurt. It was softer somehow, like the space you leave between words when you aren't ready to let them go. I unlocked the door and stepped inside first, holding it open longer than I needed to. Alexander crossed the threshold slowly, as if stepping into this little house required something greater than permission. He stood just inside the doorway, looking smaller somehow, less like the man I had married and more like the boy my mother once knew. I didn't know what to do next. So I did the only thing that felt honest. I motioned toward the kitchen. "Would you like some tea?" His shoulders dropped ever so slightly. A breath he didn't seem to realize he was holding slipped past his lips. "I'd love that," he whispered. The kettle whistled softly as I moved around the small kitchen. I found 2 chipped mugs in the cabinet, the same ones my mother and I had used for years. Alexander stood near the window, watching me like I might disappear if he blinked too long. "She really did grow mint here," I murmured, breaking the quiet. He nodded. "I planted it the day after the wedding," he replied, his voice low. "I thought maybe if you stayed long enough, you'd find it." I poured the hot water over the tea leaves, letting the steam rise between us like a bridge we didn't quite know how to cross. I handed him a mug and leaned against the counter, gripping mine like it was the only thing keeping me upright. "I need to tell you something," he said after a long moment. I braced myself, unsure if I could bear another confession. He took a slow sip before setting the mug down on the counter, his eyes never leaving mine. "Your father's debt wasn't the only thing I erased," he began quietly. I swallowed hard, the warmth in my hands suddenly feeling too much to hold. He took a step closer. "There was another deal," he continued, "before I married you. A land contract that would have destroyed your family's shop. Developers wanted it for luxury condos. I walked away from that deal. Cost me millions." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking deeper than I expected. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered. His jaw tightened. "Because I didn't want you to think I was buying your life piece by piece. I wanted you to have a choice." My chest ached with the quiet truth between. US, the kind that doesn't shout but hums low in the bones. "I never asked you to fix everything," I said softly. "I know," he replied, his voice nearly breaking. But I didn't know how to stop trying. The floor creaked softly behind us. We both turned to find my mother standing in the hallway, wrapped in her robe, her face pale but steady. She leaned against the door frame, her hand trembling slightly on the wood. "I heard voices," she whispered. Alexander stiffened as if unsure whether to stay or retreat, but I reached for his hand before he could move. "It's okay," I murmured. We crossed the room together, standing just a breath away from her. She looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time since all of this had begun. And then, to my surprise, she smiled, soft, tired, but real. "Come sit," she whispered. We sat together in the small living room, the 3 of us surrounded by old quilts and worn furniture. Alexander held his mug with both hands, staring down at the steam like it held all the things. He couldn't say aloud that my mother reached for his hand, that same hand that had once reached for her years ago. "You kept your promise," she whispered. Alexander's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "I tried," he rasped. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "And now," she continued, glancing toward me, "it's time you let her keep hers." I felt my heart catch in my chest. "What promise?" I asked softly. She smiled through her tears. "To live your life," she whispered, not mine. I leaned into Alexander's side, resting my head against his shoulder. We sat there until the sun began to rise, the quiet between us finally feeling less like a weight and more like a place to rest. Later that morning, we took her outside to the garden. The mint had started to wither in the fall chill, but she smiled anyway, brushing her fingers over the leaves like they held all the years she thought she had lost. Alexander knelt beside her, pressing his hand to the earth. "I'll plant more in the spring," he whispered. She nodded, her eyes closing for a moment, as if she could already smell the promise of it. That night, after we had tucked her back into bed, Alexander turned to me in the hallway. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for mine. "I don't know if I deserve you," he whispered. I pressed my palm to his cheek, feeling the warmth of him beneath my fingertips. "Maybe not," I replied softly, "but I think I want to try anyway." He leaned into my touch, closing his eyes as if those words were the only thing holding him together. And when he opened them again, there was no distance left between us. No walls, no contracts, no silence meant to keep us apart, just two people, learning to love without anything left to lose. Spring arrived slower than I expected. The snow melted in patches that left the ground muddy and raw, like the earth wasn't sure it was ready to bloom again. I knew the feeling. We stayed in Vermont. Longer than either of us had planned. Long enough for my mother to settle into quieter days. Long enough for the silence between Alexander and me to soften into something that felt less like distance and more like breathing. Every morning, I'd find him on the porch before the sun had fully risen, cradling a mug of coffee in his hands, staring out at the garden like it held all the answers he'd spent a lifetime chasing. He didn't speak much in those moments. Neither did I. Some mornings I'd sit beside him in the old wicker chair, our knees brushing under the quilts we shared, and we'd watch the world wake up together, slow, uncertain, but somehow study-dotted. Was on one of those mornings, just as the frost gave way to soft green shoots, that I found him standing in the middle of the yard, holding a small tray of mint seedlings. I watched from the porch, my breath catching in my throat. He knelt down, pressing his hands into the soil without hesitation. Like this time, he wasn't planting them for her. He was planting them for us. I slipped on my boots and walked down the steps, crossing the damp grass until I stood beside him. He looked up, his face softening when he saw me. "I thought we could do it together this time," he murmured. I nodded, dropping to my knees beside him without a word. And so we planted row by row, leaf by leaf. He showed me how to loosen the roots before pressing them into the earth. I showed him how to pat the soil down gently, not too tight. We worked in rhythm, our hands brushing occasionally, neither of us pulling away. The sun climbed higher, warming the back of my neck. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. He looked at me, then really looked at me. And in that moment, I knew I